crops are all in, the peaches are rotting, the oranges are piled in their creosote dump. They're flying you back to the Mexico border to pay all your money to wade back again. My father's own father, he waded that river. They took all the money he made in his life. My brothers and sisters come working the fruit trees, and they rode the trucks till they took down and died. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane, and all they will call you will be deportees. Some of us are illegal and others not wanted. Our work contract's out and we have to move on. 600 miles to the Mexico border. They chase us like outlaws, like rustlers and thieves. We died in your hills and we died on your deserts. We died in your valleys, we died on your plains. We died in your trees and we died in your bushes. Both sides of the river, we've died just the same. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane, and all they will call you will be deportees. The skyplane caught fire over Los Gatos Canyon. Like a fireball of lightning, it shook all our hills. And who are these friends, oh, scattered like dry leaves? The radio says they are just deportees. Is this the best way we can grow our big orchards? Is this the best way we can grow our good fruit? To fall like dry leaves and to rot on your topsoil and be known by no name except deportees. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adios mi amigos, Jesus y Maria. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane, and all they will call you will be deportees.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. As Marx put it famously, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. His insight makes a lot of common sense. Those individuals in corporate institutions who have great economic power in a society will generally have more political power and influence as well. They will be better able to control social and cultural institutions such as the media, the arts, sports, the military, education, religion, businesses of all sorts, publishing, the academy, and so on. All institutions that influence the narrative of what people come to think about themselves and what they think is going on around them in their society and the world. The politically outspoken independent progressive journalist, Izzy Stone, put it with his usual characteristic bluntness. Journalists work in ideologically hostile environments, military, diplomatic, business, where information is controlled. Reporters tend to be absorbed by the bureaucracies they cover. They take on the habits, attitudes, and even accents of the military or diplomatic corps. Should a reporter resist the pressure, there are many ways to get rid of him. Adding the role that racism and sexism have played historically in the attempts to express and develop alternative narratives about the American experience, one begins to realize the monumental task ahead for any progressive, independent, journalistic, and media voice in America. So we're deeply honored and excited to have one of those lifelong, courageous voices on the Radical Imagination today as our guest. He was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico, and raised in East Harlem, not far from our El Barrio Firehouse studios where we're filming. He graduated Columbia University in the mid-60s, was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and played a leading role as one of the 3 Strike Central representatives on the Strike Coordinating Committee that helped shut down the college in spring of 1968. He was a member of Students for Democratic Society and a founding member of the New York City branch of the Young Lords, serving on its first Central Committee as its Minister of Education. In 1981, he was elected president of the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights, a political organization that concerned and registered Latino voters. He was also a columnist for the New York Daily News from 1987 to 2016, where he won his first George Polk Award in 1998 for unflinching investigative reporting. He's a former president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, has been named by Hispanic Business Magazine as one of America's most influential Hispanics, and has earned a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Hispanic Academy of Media and Arts and Sciences. And of course, many of you in our audience probably are also familiar with his work as co-host of the popular independent news program Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman, which reaches over 1,200 radio and television stations. One of his recent books is entitled Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America. The book and feature-length documentary takes a long, hard look at the role that United States economic and military interests played in triggering an unprecedented wave of migration that is transforming our nation's culture and economic landscape. Hear how he puts it in the documentary. They never teach us in school that the huge Latino presence here is a direct result of our own government's actions in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America over many decades, actions that forced millions from their region to leave their homeland and journey north. Political and economic elites are, of course, reluctant to see their country's history in terms of empire and imperialism. Yet for over 90% of our existence as a country, we've been at war. And of course, many of those wars have been attempts to build and extend an empire. Policies aimed at promoting the political, economic, and cultural control of the U.S. government over areas beyond its boundaries. It's understandably more comforting for many of us to think of America as a welcoming ground for immigrants and refugees, a bastion for melting pot freedom, welcoming to its shores the tired and poor, yearning to be free. To be fair, it has been that for many. However, America's over 800 official military bases around the world, her special contingency forces in over 134 countries, are spending to fund overt and covert military forces overseas at close to $1 trillion annually, which amounts to 55 cents for every discretionary dollar in our budget, and constituting over 40% of the world's military expenditures, makes the narrative of ruling elites highly problematic to accept and justify for many whose experiences have been far different. Before we meet Juan Gonzalez, here's a brief excerpt from his documentary, Harvest of Empire.
We are all Once again, the streets of our country were taken over today by people who don't belong here.
But when the immigrants come, they come with a culture of criminality. It's out of control.
They put a strain on our Social Security, our education, our health care.
They never teach us in school that the huge Latino presence here is a direct result of our own government's actions in Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America over many decades. Thousands upon thousands of Puerto Ricans were actually recruited to come work here in the United States.
The feeling was we could very easily overthrow this progressive government and make it a lot easier for the United Fruit Company and other American businesses to operate in Central America.
From the very beginning, the West depended for its labor on Mexicans.
Are you a communist, Well, wait for the history. The history will say what we are.
I had never seen anything like El Salvador. I was more frightened there than Vietnam. What was going on there was the slaughter of the innocents.
When you finance and train a gang of uniformed butchers and they begin wholesale killing, the people don't emigrate, they flee.
The instability that we have contributed to creates the kind of chaos and disarray that leads to more immigration.
I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots, even though they may have entered illegally.
The reality is that America is changing. By the end of this century, a majority of the people will trace their origins not to Europe, but to Latin America.
We're all humans, we all have the same abilities, we all have the same potential.
America has always been a nation in the process of becoming, in process of change. It is an immigrant nation.
Welcome, Juan.
Oh, my
Thank
pleasure.
you so
My
much.
pleasure, James, to be
It's
here.
great to have you here. What a contrast of narratives there, and both at a macro level and a micro level. Let's start with your own story, your own family history, and where you settled, how you went to Columbia College, one of the elite schools of the country. How did that all come about?
Well, my mother and father came here right after World War II, and because my father and his two brothers had all served in the military during World War II in what was then called the Puerto Rican Regiment, the 65th Infantry, which was a group of soldiers recruited right out of Puerto Rico. None of them spoke any English because they were basically recruited by the military to fight the Nazis in Germany, and that's what they did. They went through with the 65th Infantry through North Africa up to boot of Italy and into Germany. But when all those soldiers came home, they were dramatically changed in their outlook. They had seen the world, they had fought to defend democracy, and yet they returned to Puerto Rico, which was in dire economic straits. So many of them decided, well, we just fought for America. Yeah. Why don't we go to live there? Because Puerto Ricans, being U.S. citizens, were able to migrate without any visas or the need for any passports.
It was a commonwealth.
It was a Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, territory of the United States, but the Congress had decreed back in 1917 that all Puerto Ricans were citizens of the United States.
Exactly.
So they were able to come, and they all came to right here to East Harlem, 112th, between 1st and 2nd was where most of my family lived initially in the late 40s and early 50s.
Today, right by Rayo's, right?
We were right by the Jefferson Pool. The Jefferson Pool was the battleground. Because basically back then all the Italians were east of 2nd Avenue. The Puerto Ricans were between 2nd and 5th, and the African Americans were on 5th or Lenox and over. But everyone had to use the pool. And so that became the big racial battleground. There were always fights over the use of the Jefferson Pool between the different ethnic and racial groups in East Harlem. So that's where we initially grew up, and gradually all of my family went to work in restaurants and the garment industry. Basically, there were a lot of jobs back then. And
back then, but they didn't come back to Puerto Rico because it was of the economic distress.
Because the island was so
industrialization
desperately poor.
Of agribusiness,
well, the government of Puerto Rico actually encouraged migration because there was so much unemployment that the government figured the more Puerto Ricans that leave, the fewer people they'll have to find jobs. They did industrialize the island, but there were many more people coming off the land than could work in the industries in Puerto Rico. So gradually, many Puerto Ricans came between 1946 and 1960. It was by then it was 800,000 Puerto Ricans were living in New York City in just that small period of time. The migration exploded. And so that was sort of the heyday of the rise of the Puerto Rican community. And most started here in East Harlem, some in the Lower East Side, and then branched outward to other parts of the city. So
which we can get to later when we talk a little more about your book, Reclaiming Gotham, and how that happened.
But basically, and of course, no one in my family had gone even to high school. I think I had one aunt who got to the first couple of grades of high school, but everyone else had either dropped out of elementary school or junior high school, and so ours was the first generation of young people who had an opportunity not only to finish high school, but then to go to college, and so I was actually the first person, not just in my immediate family, but my extended family, to go to college. I managed to get a scholarship a full scholarship to Columbia in 1964.
You're obviously a good student, so.
Yeah, I did well in school. I was the editor of my high school newspaper, and it was a paper that won a lot of prizes, and so I was able to catch the attention of the folks at Columbia, and then when they offered me a full scholarship, my mother insisted, "Oh, you got to go there." Yeah.
So then, what happens during that period? As the country becomes more radicalized.
Well, that was a period when there was a lot of ferment. My senior year in high school, Malcolm X and Evelina Antonetti led the huge public school boycott of African American and Latino students over the racism in the public schools. It eventually led to the school desegregation movement and
Ocean Hill, Brownsville.
Ocean Hill, Brownsville, IS 201 here in East Harlem, and of course the Lower East Side. Those were the three demonstration school districts.
So you became caught up in that.
Right, I was involved in that. I was very much involved with the IS 201 effort here in East Harlem, and then at Columbia as well, there was the Vietnam War was raging. There was a whole battle of the local community against the gymnasium that Columbia was building, a gymnasium for its students. And remember, Columbia is a private university, but they were building it in Morningside Park, which is a public park. And they really were not going to allow the community to use the park except on a few limited hours. So we, the students at Columbia, started protesting against the building of the gym on public land and against the university's involvement in the Vietnam War research. And so that led in 1968 to one of the historic student strikes in American history.
What did you major in? What were you studying at Columbia?
I majored in English and comparative literature.
Comparative literature?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. That's and that was my major at Columbia. They didn't have they only had a graduate journalism program, not an undergraduate journalism program. So I majored in English and comparative literature. Yeah.
So, 68 comes about. There is a takeover of buildings. There's a sort of a spontaneous, well, not spontaneous. It was organizing that took place over a period of many years, and the campus explodes. There's a general strike, and you find yourself in the middle of this. How did you become one of the three strike?
Well, there were actually a few more people on the strike coordinating committee, but I was on the strike coordinating committee because I was very friendly to some of the African American students who had their own component of the strike, as well as to some of the SDS students. I was not a member of SDS at the time. I later did become a member, and so I was basically acceptable to all sides as a leader of the strike, and that the Columbia strike sort of really helped to radicalize me dramatically in terms of my understanding. I really had not considered myself a radical or a revolutionary before that. But as I got to know a lot of the SDS people and started to do further readings I increasingly became more radical during that period of time. So by the time the strike was over, I had already sort of changed my whole view of what I wanted to do in society. So I gave up. I said, no more journalism. I'm not interested in that. No more. I just wanted to do community organizing. So about a year later, a group of young Puerto Ricans approached me that they were trying to start an organization in East Harlem, which was my old neighborhood. And they came to me and they asked me to join. And that eventually became, in July of 1969, the first group of the New York Young Lords that I became a part of.
Of course, last week we had one of your comrades on.
Yes, you had Felipe on. Yes,
and
my old comrade and chairman, Felipe.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And so let's also point out that you were one of very few Latino students on the Columbia campus, correct?
Yeah, there was, I would say, in my class of 68 at Columbia, there were maybe two or three Puerto Ricans. And there was a guy from Cleveland who I didn't know very well. But there were a few more Latinos in the graduate schools, but they were basically wealthy Latin Americans. They were the children of rich Venezuelans or rich Argentinians who had sent their kids to study at Columbia. But in terms of local U.S. Latinos, there were virtually none.
You were it.
And then there certainly weren't enough to have an organization. There was a student Afro-American society, but it was small. It had about 30, 40 members, and many of them were sons of middle-class African Americans. They were the sons of professional African Americans who had made it in the 50s and in the prior decades, and then sent their kids to Columbia.
So your kids were working class. I'm sorry, your family. Your
right. My family was completely working class. I would say that even of the small number of African Americans, there were only a few that were from working class or poor backgrounds back then. Now, of course, it's dramatically changed. You know? I think Columbia is like, I don't know, 40% people of color these days. And there's lots of people on scholarship, and there's a whole different situation. But back then it was a very, you were really culturally isolated if you were a person of color at Columbia.
And I was going to say, culturally, did you feel culturally isolated? Where did your
I felt
ethnic...
miserable.
You were miserable. Well, there's a lot of people miserable at Columbia College in those days.
My first few years at Columbia were the most miserable years of my life, in terms of like just feeling totally like lost in terms of why I was there, the kinds
what you were going to do about all this,
and also that the concerns and the interests of my fellow students were not my concerns or interests for the most part.
Interesting. So it was a natural understanding or connection with what was going on with SDS.
And with also the community struggle against the gym. I got very involved with the local community organizations fighting against Columbia.
So in a way, this book we just talked about, the framework really starts here too, at Columbia in a sense. Your sort of awareness of how economic and political elites play around with working class poor people and so on.
Well, and also when I wrote Harvest of Empire, it actually was, the first edition came out almost 20 years ago. But when I first started working on it in the early 90s, there was very little about the Latino community in the United States. Very few books or studies. Those that had been written by outsiders who really didn't know the communities, and they hadn't really explored the wide expanse of the community. Because
the diversity,
within the Latino community.
Exactly.
You know, people talk about the ethnic diversity of the United States. I say, hey, there's a huge ethnic and cultural diversity within the Latino community, and that people don't really understand. And there's development in the United States of a new phenomena, which I call the Latino in America, because it's the situation where a Puerto Rican and a Dominican who were born in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic come to New York, they marry, and they have children. Their children are both Puerto Rican and Dominican. In Los Angeles, a Salvadoran and a Mexican marry, and they have mixed nationality kids. In Miami, a Colombian and a Cuban marry, and they have mixed nationality kids. These kids, they have relationships on both their parents' side, but they have this new identity, which is a mixture not only of their own culture from their parents, but then African American and white culture that they take up when they come to the United States. So they are this new thing, which is the Latino in America.
Is being played out in a sense, and
in
you're
a sense. But
that.
what I try to show is that there's a lot more richness within the Latino identity and culture than people realize.
Break that down a little for us here, for our audience.
Well, Puerto Ricans don't eat tamales, you know.
Okay.
We're not that much into guacamole. You know, it's. I mean, from the food to the music to the cultural mores, there are substantial differences between the different Latino nationalities, and there is something that binds us all together in that we all speak the same language, Spanish, and even the children don't necessarily speak it that well, but they understand it. But there's a richness of the culture that often Anglos looking from the outside just see, oh, they're all Hispanic.
It's all the same, right.
It's not the same. And the reasons why people come, the times that they come, the class distinctions and the migration.
And they bring the similar feuds and gripes from the old country?
From the old country here. Yeah. So that, for instance, when I discovered the Colombian migration to the United States, initially it was a very middle class migration. It was not working class and poor people as it was with Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. The Cuban migration, the Colombian migration were much more middle class migrations, educated people who came here with their own skills that they had developed in their own countries, and therefore they had a different attitude to how they were going to make it in America than did people who came as laborers or who came as agricultural workers and who didn't have education.
More conservative politically?
I would say
culturally
certainly
also?
in the Cuban situation, because many were fleeing a revolution there. In the Colombian situation, not so much. They were not as conservative because they were coming because of the social dislocations that occurred in their country. But then the Dominican migration was a highly politicized migration. The Dominicans who came to the United States in the 60s and 70s were, many were educated, but they were radical. They were actually being pushed out of the Dominican Republic by the United States and the conservative government that wanted to get rid of its radicals. Right? They wanted to ease the political tensions in the country. So you had, I would say, throughout the 70s and the 80s in the United States, the most radical Latino population was the Dominican population.
So level of political consciousness.
Because they had come out of a revolution.
Right.
The 65 revolution in the Dominican Republic and the invasion of the United States into the Dominican Republic that created a whole different dynamic. So they were fleeing a failed revolution, but they were going to the country that crushed the revolution.
And the Cubans didn't leave the revolutionaries there, stayed here, and the ones who did leave were generally much more politically conservative.
Much more conservative.
And against the revolution.
So what I try to do is I try to show that there's a lot more richness within the Latino community that you really, unless you try to delve into it and understand how each group came and what brought them here, you really don't understand the dynamic of how the communities were being built in this country.
Groundbreaking work, and it's, you were saying, hundreds of colleges use this text?
I've been shocked by, I think it's something like 200 colleges use it now as a required text, and it's still selling very well 20 years later. And in fact, my publisher is beating me, saying we have to do another edition. We have to update it because they want the sales to continue. Yeah.
And there's make no mistake about it. It's very radical in its orientation too. It doesn't mince words about the fact that to a considerable extent, all of this forced migrations and so on, caused by military actions, covert and overt.
Well, and I also think,
how would you put it?
I try to explain.
Or economic distress. I know the way you put it is so wonderful that Latin America, Central America became the incubator for corporate elites.
Of the United States,
of the
certainly.
United States, yes.
But one of the points I try to make, and it's so important and so timely because immigration continues to be such a volatile and emotional issue, not only in the United States but around the world. And one of the points I make in the book is that we're not alone.
Yeah.
Right. In France is in constant convulsion over the fact that there are so many Algerians, Tunisians, and Moroccans who are dramatically changing the nature of French society. In England, they are constantly grappling with the fact that the influx over the last 40, 50 years of Indians, Pakistanis, and Jamaicans has dramatically transformed the United Kingdom. In Germany, they're constantly dealing with the massive influx of Turks that came into Germany in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Well, what do all of these have in common? The reason there are so many Algerians, Tunisians, and Moroccans in France is because that was the colonial empire of France. The reason there are so many Indians, Pakistanis, and Jamaicans in England is because that was the colonial empire of England. And the reason there's so many Turks in Germany is because Germany attempted, after World War I, to pick up the pieces of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and delve into the Middle East and begin a new colonizing attempt. So in effect, all of the advanced countries of the West are dealing with the unintended harvest of their empires. They went to the Asia, Africa, and Latin America to extract wealth and resources.
Yeah.
They never expected that they would create the communication systems and the transportation systems and the consciousness that would eventually draw the people of those countries. And what they did often is that they impressed the colonial soldiers into their armies. The French drafted Algerians and Tunisians and Moroccans to fight the Nazis. The British drafted Indians and Pakistanis and Jamaicans to fight the Nazis. So when all of these soldiers came home, as my parents did, they were colonial soldiers. When they came home, they now, one, were militarily trained, had a much more aggressive sense of themselves in the world, and demanded equal rights. And so you had the vast explosion of the independence movements in Africa and Asia after World War II, but you also had the migrations to the metropolis from these colonial countries. And so in essence, what Europe is facing and what the United States is facing today is the harvest of its 19th and early 20th century empires. Only the harvest came in people that they never expected would come in such numbers to their shores.
And rather than really dealing with the issues, it becomes more convenient by ruling elites to push back in racist ways and blame the victim. They become scapegoats. They're terrorists, they're rapists, they're drug dealers, and so on.
Right, and they never want to
That's
deal
the narrative.
with the root causes of the migration.
Which would mean looking at themselves.
Right, why are so many people leaving their countries? And I mean, you take the United States, 65% of all the undocumented migration to the United States comes from one country, Mexico. 2/3 comes from one country. So is it really a worldwide problem, or is it really a problem of the bi-national relations between the United States and Mexico? Well, first of all, half of Mexico was taken by the United States to create a huge portion of the United States. It's called California, Texas, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona. That was all part of Mexico. And there were Mexicans living on that land previous to the United States acquiring it. So that really there's been a systematic exploitation of Mexican resources and labor by the United States since the early 1800s. So to think that you can continue to maintain desperate poverty right on your border, and while you are a country living in absolute wealth, it's not realistic. Eventually, the people are going to move, and I think that's what's increasingly happened. And because it's one economy, it may be two nations, but it's one economy.
Now, your most recent book, Reclaiming Gotham, makes a point soon, very soon, 70% people in the world will be living in cities. The hope for some sort of progressive politics movements rests in those cities. Now, how do the first of all, how does the Latino community? How does the Latino community
I think
play on all that?
what you have is that in
what's happening
the
there?
cities are not only where more and more people are gravitating toward, they're also the most racially and ethnically diverse. They're generally the most open and inclusive, and they're still the centers of economic activity. So the problem is that we have a situation in this country where our national and regional politics are controlled by rural and conservative forces. Because of the way the political structure of the United States exists, small states,
the electoral system,
in the electoral system have disproportionate power at the national level. The way that districts are gerrymandered at the state level means that the rural and upstate areas of every state have much more power than the cities. So you have a situation where the cities, the major cities, provide the most economic growth and vitality, but they are constantly under the thumb of the rural and conservative forces. But the problem is that the cities keep growing in size, and the rural areas of the country are not growing in size. They're shrinking in size and population. And so you're increasingly having this major divide. And it's not just, again, I don't think it's exceptional to the United States. The same thing is happening in
all across Europe,
all across Western Europe. You know that.
Right.
You know, you have now in the United Kingdom, there's a Muslim mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. You know, in France, there's a socialist mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. In Spain, there's a radical mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, and is spread, and more of the municipal radical movement is gaining control of major cities in Spain. In Puerto Rico, you have a very conservative governor, Ricky Rosselló, and you have a very progressive and radical mayor, Carmen Yulín Cruz, in San Juan, the major city of Puerto Rico. So
who stood up to Trump?
She's the one who stood up to Trump.
Right.
No one knew her until she stood up to Trump. I started writing about her in my book, but she only became famous after Hurricane Maria, when she stood up to Trump. So that basically what's happening is that the big cities of the advanced world are growing and becoming more and more radical in their political orientation, whereas the national governments, the regional and state governments, are more conservative and right-wing in their orientation. So I believe we're heading toward a clash between the cities and the right-wing states and governments, and you're seeing it in things like sanctuary cities, you know, like what to do about climate change, whereas Trump rejected the Paris Accords, and a whole bunch of big city mayors said, well, we're going to implement the Paris Accords ourselves. Right. We're going to do what we can to do it.
Well, the mayor of Boston says Trump's not welcome here.
Right. And you notice, Trump never holds rallies in big cities.
Right.
Never. It's always in some like small suburban area or some small town. But he doesn't go into any of the big cities, because ever since that huge near riot during his campaign in Chicago, when his whole rally was completely disrupted, they can't figure out a way to control a big crowd in a big city. So he basically stays away from the cities. Now, what kind of president doesn't go to any of the major cities of the country that he's president of?
But you've also pointed out that there's a real danger that he would use troops and actually arrest or try to arrest local officials, mayors who go against
I think that's where we're heading. I think that's where we're heading.
There
are going to be direct confrontations between local officials, and of course the other areas are police abuse. More and more cities are trying to pass more police accountability laws, whereas and even electing radical or progressive prosecutors now. We're seeing that in many places, and they're going completely against the grain of what's happening at the national and the regional or state levels.
So you're painting a picture of even more intense polarization. of the country.
Yeah, I think we're heading into more and more polarization. I think that there is a growing fascist and right-wing movement, not just in the United States, but obviously we've seen it across the United Kingdom and all of Europe. I think we are heading toward a much more intense polarization over the next few years. And I'm afraid it's going to get really nasty. Even on election times, they're going to. We used to joke that in Puerto Rico in the '60s, every election there'd be 5 or 6 people killed. That was how intense the rivalries between political parties got. The United States always just say, "Oh no, we have peaceful elections." I'm not so sure our elections are going to be that peaceful in the coming years. The way that the rhetoric and the attacks have been intensified, especially through social media, between those who are opposed politically.
What about the role of independent, progressive politicians and politics, new parties, or even we talked a little before. I know your admiration for Reverend Barber, Poor People's Campaign, fusion politics, trying to see the connections, pointing out what you pointed out in Harvest of Empire there, how we're all sort of pitted against each other, and why fight against each other? Let's unite against the forces that are creating the misery for us all. What about those?
Well, I think independent politics is very crucial and important at this point, especially in terms of assuring a more progressive direction and not allowing the Democratic Party to be increasingly go to the right in an effort to maintain some people in office. So I think that the independent politics is important and critical, and the pressure from the grassroots on all elected officials, no matter who they are, is critical. But I think that we may increasingly be facing a danger of, and it always happens in times of upsurge of right-wing movements, of ultra-left politics, of people who are so furious about what is happening in the system that they don't want to make any compromises, and they don't want to, and so.
Who would you classify that? Intifada or what sort of group?
No, not just the anarchist movement. I think that there's for instance,
give me some examples.
I think it was a huge mistake for many of the Bernie Sanders supporters. Once Bernie Sanders had lost his race, and understanding all of the machinations that occur within the Democratic Party. But Bernie Sanders had made it clear from the beginning that if he didn't win the nomination, he was going to support whoever the nominee of the Democratic Party was. What happened is a section of the Bernie Sanders supporters would not go along with that. And they said, no, we will never accept Hillary Clinton as president. And so they either stayed home, or they voted for Jill Stein, or they voted for Rocky Anderson, or they voted for somebody else, or they stayed home.
That's a mistake.
And I believe that was a mistake. And I said that before the election, and I say that from my own experience when I was in SDS in 1968, and that movement. A good portion of the anti-war movement had backed Eugene McCarthy for president, and then after Lyndon Johnson decided that he wasn't going to run again for Bobby Kennedy, some supported Bobby Kennedy. When Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, then the Democratic Party brokered a deal to put Hubert Humphrey as a Democratic Party candidate. He was a liberal Democrat, but a centrist Democrat, and certainly not anti-war. And all of us in SDS said, "Heck with that. We're not going to."
Including yourself at that time.
Including myself. We said, "No way. We're going to vote for Hubert Humphrey." And we said, "Vote in the street. Vote with your feet." That was the slogan of the SDS and many of the radicals at that point.
So we got Nixon.
The result is we got Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon began a conservative wave in America that went on for really with a short interruption of Watergate, and it went on for, by the time that revolution was over, even the Democrats were right wing and conservative, and so I learned from that huge mistake back then in 1968 that you can make ultra left what you believe to be true in principle, that you can make an ultra left strategic mistake and end up hurting your movement even more. Right now, in New York City, Bill de Blasio. I mean, in my book on Reclaiming Gotham, I wrote quite a bit about not only de Blasio but other mayors. But I've gotten quite a bit of criticism for people who say, "Oh, de Blasio's not a real progressive. He's not, look at all the things he hasn't done."
Okay.
And I say, and I say to them, count the mayors of New York City, going backwards. Michael Bloomberg, Rudy Giuliani, David Dinkins, before Dinkins, Ed Koch, before Koch, Abe Beame, before Abe Beame, John Lindsay, before John Lindsay, Robert Wagner, before Robert Wagner, Impellitteri. None of those have been anywhere.
Go a little further back, you get
you got to go back. You got to go back to LaGuardia.
That's who we really need.
You have to go back to LaGuardia to find anyone who has been nearly as progressive on a wide variety of things as Bill de Blasio. Now, has he done everything that people expected of him? No. Has he screwed up on a bunch of occasions? Yes. But if you look at the overall record,
and the transfer of wealth more to the working class.
And the transfer of wealth. But I would say that even David Dinkins, who was a member of Democratic Socialists of America, people forget that. Dinkins was a Democratic Socialist. He was inept. He didn't get that much accomplished at the time he was in office. So when you look at all of the mayors of New York City, the fact that de Blasio has accomplished what he's managed to accomplish should be counted as he was responding to the progressive movement and the upsurge that had occurred in the city post-Occupy and post-Great Recession.
Where are the Latino voters in the city, in New York City, today on all of this? How would you describe their possible involvement and input as progressive agents of change?
I think, generally speaking, the African American Latino communities are, and this is not true nationwide, but I think here in the city, they're a lot more progressive than people give them credit for. And I think that there's a lot more independence from the party machineries than people give them credit for. I mean, the best example of that was when Jesse Jackson ran for president in 1984. Almost all the political leadership of New York didn't back him, yet he won the African American Latino communities, even though the entire leadership of the city was not with him. And so I think that that there is African Americans and Latinos do respond to who is best meeting their needs and interests. In terms of their policies, and they don't get as much caught up in the what I call the glitz and the scandal of individual actions of a particular political leader. They say, what's this political leader done to help our community and make our lives better?
Right. So it's more the policies.
Yeah.
Realpolitik in a sense. So 50 years. Columbia Rebellion, 2018. What have you seen? How would you sum up your own activism? The country.
You said something earlier about how do you maintain independent journalism, which is what I've been doing most of my life is journalism. It's been reporting. I have been forced into activism at different points in my career, but largely I've been certainly for the last 40 years, a working journalist trying to report the news. And what I say is I've had the opportunity to work in what I call the three great streams of American journalism. And I wrote about this in my other book, News for All the People, which is first the corporate and commercial press, which is what most people understand to be the press in America. It's the corporate and commercial press, which has its own long history, some of it good, most of it terrible, going back to the patriot prince of the colonial era that really organized the public to overthrow British rule, through the great newspapers of the late 19th century and the Pulitzer and Hearst and Scripps chains, and then through the big networks, CBS, NBC, and then of course the cable systems that came up, and now of course the huge commercial social media platforms of Facebook and Twitter. That's the commercial press. It has its own history. Some great journalism has occurred in it, but a lot of bad journalism has occurred in it. So I've worked in the commercial press for 40 years. I also, though, have worked in what I call the dissident or alternative press, which has its own separate history, dating back to the working men's press of the 1830s, to the muckrakers, Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, Ray Stannard Baker, and the muckrakers of the turn of the century, through the New Left press of the 60s and the 70s, to shows like Democracy Now! And Alternet and Common Dreams, and all the other existing dissident press, which has always presented a different perspective to the American people than the corporate or the commercial press.
We try to do that here.
And has always challenged the existing media system. But there's a third stream of the press in America, which I've also had the opportunity to work in, which is the press by people of color. Because for over 200 years, both the commercial press and the dissident press systematically excluded African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans from being a part of the press. So they had to form their own press. Freedom Journal, 1827, here in New York, the first black newspaper in America.
Amsterdam News?
Well, the Amsterdam News was a later version, but I'm talking about the original pioneers. The Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper in the world in 1828 in Newachota, Georgia. The Golden Hills News, the first Chinese newspaper in America in the 1850s in San Francisco. The Spanish language press of the borderlands in New York City. So the people of color had to create their own narrative. In fact, the first editorial in John Russwurm's Freedom's Journal was, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long
and
have
we've
others
got to
spoken
plead
for us."
our own cause by thanking you so much.
So
time has run out.
Yeah, but that's the press, and I've been able to work in all three of them.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
it's been an honor, a pleasure, and I'm just so grateful and thankful for you being here, recounting your journey. It's been my journey too. So thanks again.
Okay,
thank you all so very, very much for watching The Radical Imagination. We're going to go out with some music by Santana.
Okay.
Thank you again. See you next week.